What happens when the most dangerous evidence in a courtroom isn't a document pulled from a filing cabinet, but a sentence someone once typed without thinking? Not shouted, not published, not meant to survive. Just a line, a moment, a few words sent into the dark, assumed to be private, assumed to be harmless, assumed to be gone. That's where this begins. Not with a bang, not with outrage, but with a pause that settled over a London courtroom this week. The kind that makes pens stop moving, the kind that causes lawyers to look up instead of down, the kind that tells you something has shifted even before anyone says it out loud. Because this wasn't supposed to be that kind of day. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was supposed to be familiar territory. Another appearance. Another chapter in a long-running legal war. Another reminder of how deeply the British press once burrowed into the private life of Prince Harry. We've heard this story before, or at least we thought we had. Phone hacking, intrusion, paranoia, the sense of being watched, the sense that nothing, not even a relationship, could survive under that kind of pressure. Harry has said it for years, in interviews, in books, in statements read into court records. The press destroyed his relationships. Knowingly false stories snowballed. Trust eroded, love suffocated, and on paper, that argument still stood when he took the stand. Until it didn't. Because this time, the spotlight didn't land on editors or publishers first. It landed on his own words. Words spoken long before courtrooms and witness boxes. Words sent to someone he trusted. Words that were never meant to be read aloud by anyone else. And suddenly, the story narrowed. From institutions to individuals. From systems to sentences. From what was done to him to what he himself had said. That's the moment the room changed. No gasps, no murmurs, just that quiet, uncomfortable stillness that follows when everyone realizes the ground has shifted and no one is quite sure where to stand anymore. Because at the center of this wasn't a tabloid headline. It was a phone, a message thread, a timestamp, and a woman who hadn't spoken publicly in years. Chelsy Davy wasn't in court to make accusations. She wasn't there to relive heartbreak or rewrite history. She wasn't even framed as a witness in the traditional sense. She appeared in the record as something else entirely, a timeline. For nearly a decade, her name has hovered at the edges of Harry's story, invoked as proof of what he lost, cited as evidence of how brutal the press could be, remembered as the relationship that couldn't survive the glare. Harry himself has described it that way. He told the court that the constant stories had a snowball effect, that the pressure became unbearable. That paranoia crept into every call, every message, every plan. And maybe that's true. But courtrooms don't deal in maybe. They deal in sequence. And sequence is unforgiving. Because Chelsy lived thousands of miles away for much of their relationship. South Africa, long distance, late nights, missed calls, long conversations carried almost entirely through phones and text messages. Which means something crucial. It means that unlike memory, which bends and softens with time, those conversations didn't disappear. They stayed. And in a case about privacy, irony has a way of cutting deep. The same medium Harry says was exploited by the press, phones, texts, private communication, became the medium that preserved his own private voice exactly as it was. Not curated, not reframed, not polished for public consumption. Just him. That's the contradiction at the heart of this moment. And contradictions are dangerous things in court, especially when they're quiet. Because what Chelsy handed over, according to those present, wasn't a dramatic reveal. No theatrics, no emotional speech, just unpublished screenshots of private messages. Receipts, in the most literal sense. And here's where it gets complicated. These messages weren't introduced to prove betrayal, or cruelty, or scandal. They were introduced to establish tone, to show how Harry spoke when he thought no one else was listening, to anchor dates, to align overlaps, to test credibility. And somewhere in that process, something unexpected surfaced. Because nestled among ordinary conversations, affection, frustration, and long-distance longing, were remarks that didn't sit easily beside the public narrative Harry would later present to the world. Sarcastic, dismissive, careless, maybe. Comments about a woman he would eventually marry. Meghan Markle wasn't the focus of this case. Not officially, not legally, but she was there, all the same. In the margins, in the subtext, in messages sent before anything was supposed to be serious. And this is where the courtroom tension sharpened, because Harry has framed his life in clean chapters, before and after, innocence and intrusion, love found, love lost. But text messages don't respect narrative arcs. They sit exactly where they were sent. And according to those who've seen them, some of these messages landed in a window that raised uncomfortable questions. Questions no one in that room had expected to be asking. At least not yet. Questions like, what did Harry believe at the time? Who did he trust with the truth? And how casually did he speak when the stakes felt lower? One line, in particular, reportedly drew a reaction, not audible, but visible. A slight shift, a pause, a sentence that suggested detachment, that suggested minimization, that suggested something far less romantic than the devotion later professed in interviews and memoirs. It wasn't cruel, necessarily, but it was revealing. And revelations don't need volume to be devastating. Here's what makes this moment so delicate. Harry isn't on trial for what he said in private. That's not the case. No one is accusing him of a crime for having complicated emotions or speaking loosely in a personal conversation. What's being examined is consistency. Because this is a lawsuit against Associated Newspapers, a publisher Harry accuses of unlawful information gathering and knowingly false reporting. His argument hinges on causation, on damage, on the idea that press intrusion directly eroded his relationships. But when private messages show a more nuanced emotional landscape, one where skepticism, distance, or irony already existed, the chain of cause becomes harder to draw cleanly. And courts care about clean lines. That's why this isn't tabloid fodder. This isn't about gossip. It's about whether a narrative presented under oath can withstand the pressure of its own primary sources. Because screenshots don't editorialize. They don't explain themselves. They just exist. And the moment they do, everyone in the room has to recalibrate. Harry himself appeared to sense it. Observers noted a change in his demeanor as questioning tightened. Answers became more careful, less expansive. The confidence that marked earlier testimony softened into something more guarded. This wasn't a man unraveling theatrically. It was subtler than that. It was the look of someone realizing that the safest version of the story might no longer be enough. And that's the real tension here. Not whether Harry was wronged by the press. That argument still stands in many respects. But whether the story he's told about how and why his relationships collapsed can remain intact once his own words are placed beside it. Because once that happens, the court stops asking what the press did and starts asking what was already happening. That's why this matters now. Not because it's shocking, not because it's salacious, but because it forces a reckoning with something far more uncomfortable. The idea that two truths can exist at the same time. That Harry may have been genuinely harmed by intrusion, and that his private language may not align neatly with the public pain he later described. Courts are not built to resolve emotional contradictions gently. They surface them and leave everyone else to sit with the implications. So as this case moves forward, keep one thing in mind. The most consequential evidence isn't always what someone else uncovered. Sometimes it's what someone left behind without realizing it would ever be read again. And now that it has been, the question isn't whether the press crossed lines. It's whether Harry's own words have drawn a new one, right through the middle of his case. Because once the timestamps were aligned, the story stopped being about what the media did and started becoming about what Harry himself said and when. The shift didn't announce itself. That's the thing people keep getting wrong when they try to describe what happened next. They talk about drama, about tension, about some explosive courtroom moment. But that's not how it unfolded. It was quieter than that, almost procedural, and that's precisely why it mattered. Because when a narrative begins to slip in a courtroom, it rarely does so with raised voices or objections shouted across polished wood. It slips in the pauses, in the way a question is repeated, not because it wasn't heard, but because it was heard too clearly, in the way an answer comes back slightly shorter than before, slightly more guarded. That was the atmosphere inside the High Court of Justice in London when Prince Harry returned to the witness box. On paper, nothing had changed. Same case, same allegations, same publisher across the aisle, same premise, that years of unlawful intrusion by the press had done lasting damage to his life and relationships. But something in the room knew better. You could see it in the way the lawyers stopped leaning back in their chairs, in the way notes were no longer scribbled casually but written with intention, in the way Harry himself adjusted, subtly, as the questions began to narrow. This wasn't a collapse. It was a contraction. The kind that happens when the boundaries of a story suddenly tighten. And it began with a question that sounded almost harmless. A clarifying question, a sequencing question, a question about timing. Those are the most dangerous ones. Because timing is where narratives go to die. Harry had already laid out the emotional arc the court had come to expect. He spoke again about the sense of being watched, about how stories appeared in the press that felt too specific to be coincidence, about the way that intrusion fed paranoia, not just toward the media, but toward people around him. He used the phrase snowball effect, not for the first time. The idea that one story led to another, that pressure compounded, that trust eroded not in one dramatic collapse, but in a slow, grinding way that relationships couldn't survive. It's a compelling argument. It always has been. But courts don't just listen for compelling arguments. They listen for alignment. And alignment is where things began to drift. The questioning moved away from generalities and toward instances. Not the press, but this period. Not relationships, but this relationship. Not stories, but communications. And as the frame narrowed, the emotional safety of abstraction disappeared. Because abstraction allows you to speak in truth-adjacent language. It allows you to describe how things felt without having to account for what was actually said. It gives you room. Specifics don't. Specifics demand accounting. At first, Harry handled it smoothly. He's been doing this long enough to know how to pace an answer, how to give enough without giving too much, how to remain composed without sounding rehearsed. But then came the pivot. A lawyer referenced private communications, not content, not yet, just their existence. Messages exchanged during a period Harry had already described as deeply affected by press intrusion. Harry acknowledged them. Of course he did. There was no denying that much of his long-distance relationship with Chelsy Davy had been conducted through calls and texts. He'd said as much himself in his witness statement. That admission, once harmless, now carried weight. Because when you say that the majority of your most intimate conversations happened through a medium, you also admit that those conversations may still exist. And that's when the air changed. Not because anyone accused Harry of anything, but because everyone in the room understood the implication at the same time. Those messages weren't memory. They were record. And records don't bend. The lawyer didn't rush. That would have broken the spell. Instead, the questioning slowed, almost deliberately, as if allowing the reality of that implication to settle before moving on. Harry was asked about tone, about how he communicated privately when the press felt omnipresent, about whether that paranoia he described made him more guarded or more candid in his messages. It's a deceptively simple line of inquiry, because if you say you became guarded, then the court may ask why certain messages appear relaxed, even dismissive. And if you say you remained candid, then the court may ask how that squares with the claim that paranoia governed every exchange. Either way, you're cornered by your own framing. Harry answered carefully. He spoke about stress, about trying to maintain normalcy, about using humor and sarcasm as coping mechanisms. All reasonable, all human. But reasonable explanations don't always neutralize contradiction. They coexist with it. And that coexistence is uncomfortable. You could sense Harry becoming more aware of that discomfort as the questioning continued. His posture shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. His answers grew tighter, less expansive. He paused more often before responding, as if weighing not just the truth of the moment, but the potential afterlife of each sentence. Because at this point, everyone understood something critical. The case was no longer moving forward on emotion alone. It was moving forward on comparison. Comparison between what Harry has said publicly over the years and what he said privately at the time. Between how he describes his emotional state now and how he expressed it then. And comparison is merciless. It doesn't care about growth. It doesn't care about hindsight. It doesn't care about intent. It simply places two things side by side and asks the court to notice the difference. This is where Chelsy Davy re-entered the story, not as a former girlfriend, not as a symbol of lost love, but as a custodian of context. Her role here wasn't emotional. It was structural. She represented a fixed point in time. A period when Harry was not yet married, not yet a public crusader against the press, not yet telling his story from a distance of years. She represented the now. And what she brought with her, through counsel, through records, wasn't accusation. It was alignment. Or, more precisely, misalignment. Because as the court examined the periods Harry described as most corrosive, the messages from those same windows told a more layered story. One where frustration existed alongside detachment. Where concern existed alongside irony. Where the emotional temperature wasn't always as singular as later narratives suggested. And here's the crucial distinction. This didn't disprove Harry's claims. That's not how this works. What it did was complicate them. And complication is dangerous in court. Because a case built on causation, on the idea that A led directly to B, struggles when additional variables appear. The defense didn't need to argue that the press caused no harm. They only needed to suggest that not all harm flowed from the press, that some dynamics existed independently, that some cracks predated the intrusion or at least ran alongside it. And once that suggestion is credible, the burden shifts. Suddenly, the court isn't just evaluating whether unlawful tactics occurred. It's evaluating whether those tactics can be shown to be the decisive factor in the collapse of these relationships. That's a much steeper climb. Harry, to his credit, didn't lash out. He didn't grow defensive. He didn't accuse Chelsy or anyone else of misrepresentation. He acknowledged complexity. He acknowledged imperfection. But acknowledgments, too, have consequences. Because once you admit complexity, you can no longer rely on absolutes. And this case has leaned heavily on absolutes. Knowingly false. Snowball effect. Destroyed. Those are strong words. Effective words. But they leave little room for nuance. And nuance is exactly what private messages introduce. As the session wore on, the questions edged closer to overlap. To periods where Harry's public narrative places emotional devastation at the door of the press, while private communications suggest something more ambivalent. Not happy, but not singularly broken either. That's the tension no one could ignore. And it's why observers began whispering afterward that something fundamental had shifted, even if no single moment could be pointed to as the cause. Because this wasn't about catching Harry in a lie. It was about revealing the distance between a story told later and a voice preserved earlier. And distance, in court, demands explanation. The judge didn't intervene. There was no need. The process was doing its work quietly, efficiently, almost politely. But make no mistake, this was the day the narrative slipped out of its groove. Not enough to derail the case. Not yet, but enough to ensure it would never travel the same path again. Because once private words enter the legal arena, they don't just support or undermine a claim. They redefine the terrain. And as the court adjourned for the day, one thing was clear to everyone present. This was no longer just a case about what the press took. It was becoming a case about what Harry gave, freely, casually, and without imagining it would one day be weighed under oath. Chelsy Davy didn't arrive in this case the way most people expected her to. There was no dramatic entrance. No statement read aloud that cracked with emotion. No carefully staged narrative reclaiming the past. In fact, if you weren't paying close attention to the filings and the way the questioning evolved, you could almost miss the moment she truly entered the room at all. And that's part of what makes it so unsettling. Because she didn't come in as a voice. She came in as a structure. For years, Chelsy Davy has existed in Prince Harry's story as a kind of emotional shorthand. The girlfriend who couldn't handle the glare. The relationship crushed under the weight of press intrusion. Though what might have been that proved just how destructive the media machine could be. Harry has referenced her that way repeatedly, not unkindly, not dismissively, almost reverently at times, as evidence, as proof. And courts like proof. But what the court received this week wasn't the Chelsy Davy of memory. It was something far more precise. A timeline. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Because memory is flexible. It bends to context. It reshapes itself around later events. It absorbs meaning retroactively. What once felt minor can become monumental years later, once you know how the story ends. Timelines don't do that. They sit there, cold, unmoved. And Chelsy's role in this case is defined by that immobility. To understand why, you have to step back from the courtroom for a moment and look at the relationship itself. Not romantically, but mechanically. Harry and Chelsy were, for much of their time together, long distance. Different continents, different time zones, different lives. Their relationship wasn't conducted through shared routines or domestic familiarity. It was conducted through devices, phones, text messages, late-night calls that stretched across borders. Harry acknowledged this himself in his witness statement. He described how, because Chelsy lived in South Africa, the majority of their communication happened through phone calls and texts. He spoke about the trust that required, the intimacy of it, the sense that those conversations were safe. That safety is central to his argument. Because Harry's claim is not just that the press intruded on his life, it's that their intrusion destroyed the sanctity of spaces that were supposed to be private. That even behind closed doors, he could not escape the sense of being observed. But when your most intimate space is a digital one, privacy takes on a different shape. It leaves traces. And those traces don't disappear when the relationship ends. They don't disappear when the narrative evolves. They don't disappear when memory softens. They remain exactly as they were, waiting. That's why Chelsy's contribution here is so structurally significant. She doesn't have to accuse Harry of anything. She doesn't have to reinterpret his feelings or challenge his pain. She doesn't even have to say much at all. All she has to do is allow the record to exist. And that record does something subtle but powerful. It anchors Harry's emotional claims to specific dates, specific moods, specific moments in time. Which means the court is no longer evaluating a story told in retrospect. It's evaluating whether that story aligns with the contemporaneous evidence. That's a dangerous shift. Because when Harry talks about paranoia, about feeling watched, about becoming careful and suspicious in his communications, he's asking the court to accept a psychological arc, one that escalates, one that narrows, one that erodes trust. But the messages associated with that same period don't always read like someone shrinking inward. Some read as casual, some as ironic, some as emotionally distant in a way that isn't easily explained by fear alone. That doesn't make Harry dishonest. It makes him human, but human complexity doesn't always help legal arguments, especially when those arguments rely on clean causation. This is where the idea of Chelsy as a timeline becomes so critical. Because the court isn't interested in who hurt whom emotionally. It's interested in sequence. What happened first? What happened alongside what? What changed and when? Chelsy's messages don't answer those questions conclusively, but they do something just as impactful. They prevent easy answers. And that's enough. You could feel that realization settle over the courtroom as her role became clearer. Not because anyone said it outright, but because the questions began to orbit her presence more deliberately, not her feelings, her timestamps. Harry was asked to clarify periods, to confirm dates, to situate his emotional recollections against specific windows of time. Each clarification tightened the frame a little more. And with each tightening, the room grew quieter. Because once you commit to a timeline, you lose the freedom of vagueness. You can no longer say around that time without someone asking, which time? You can no longer say because of the press without someone asking, before or after this? Chelsy's messages made those questions unavoidable. They also raised another, more delicate issue, one that hovered in the background without being spoken aloud. Intent, not legal intent. Emotional intent. What did Harry believe in those moments? What did he expect to happen next? What weight did he attach to the people in his life at the time? These are not questions courts like to answer directly, but they answer them indirectly all the time. Through tone, through consistency, through alignment. And that's where things began to feel unsteady. Because some of the messages attributed to Harry during this period reportedly carry a tone that doesn't sit comfortably beside the devastation he later described. Not cruel, not heartless, but not singularly invested either. There's a difference between being overwhelmed by external pressure and being emotionally ambivalent. They can coexist, but they're not the same thing. And courts are very good at noticing when different explanations are doing overlapping work. That overlap doesn't prove anything on its own, but it invites doubt, which is all the defense needs. What's particularly striking here is how little Chelsy herself has to do to create this effect. She doesn't need to contradict Harry's testimony. She doesn't need to reframe the relationship publicly. She doesn't need to tell her version of events. Her silence is part of her power. Because the messages speak without inflection, without emotion, without agenda. They simply sit there, immutable. And immutable things have a way of unsettling stories that rely on evolution. As this became clear, the dynamic of the case shifted again, slightly, but noticeably. Harry's legal team leaned more heavily on context, on psychological strain, on the cumulative effect of intrusion, on how private communication can be performative in its own way, a space where people mask fear with humor, distance with irony. All valid arguments, but also defensive ones. And defensive arguments signal vulnerability. The defense, meanwhile, didn't push aggressively. They didn't need to. They allowed the material to exist, trusting the court to do the math on its own. That's a confident strategy, because once a timeline is in play, pressure builds naturally. Every statement is measured against it. Every recollection is tested by it. Every emotional claim is weighed beside it. And no matter how compelling the story, something always gets left behind in that comparison. This is why Chelsy's presence in this case feels so different from how she's been discussed before. She's no longer an emotional casualty in Harry's narrative. She's a fixed reference point. And fixed points are unforgiving. As the day moved on, it became clear that this wasn't a detour in the case. It was a new axis. The court was no longer simply examining whether the press crossed lines. It was examining whether Harry's internal story, the one he tells about himself, his relationships, his motivations, holds together when pinned to the record. That's a much more intimate inquiry. And it's one that doesn't end quickly. Because once you open that door, everything inside has to be accounted for. Not just what was said publicly, but what was said casually, privately, without thought of consequence. Which brings us to the part of Chelsy's contribution that hasn't yet been fully explored. Because timelines don't just show when things happened. They show what overlapped. And as the court began aligning messages with moments Harry described as pivotal, it became increasingly clear that the next phase of questioning wouldn't be about Chelsy herself. It would be about what else was happening at the same time. And who else was already in the frame. The first thing to understand about the messages is that they were never introduced all at once. There was no dramatic unveiling. No stack of printed screenshots slid across a table. No audible reaction from the gallery. If you weren't listening carefully, you might have missed the moment when they actually entered the case at all. That was deliberate, because when evidence is explosive, the most effective way to deploy it isn't to throw it into the room and let it detonate. It's to let it seep. Slowly, quietly, line by line. That's what happened here. At first, the court was simply made aware that unpublished text messages existed. Not their content, not their tone, just their presence. Messages exchanged during a period Harry himself had already described as emotionally volatile, defined by paranoia, stress, and the corrosive impact of press intrusion. That alone was enough to recalibrate the room. Because unpublished messages are different from anything Harry has dealt with publicly before. Interviews are curated. Books are edited. Statements are polished by teams of lawyers. Text messages aren't. They exist in the voice of the moment. The unguarded version. The version that doesn't expect to be remembered, let alone scrutinized. And courts know this. That's why they carry so much weight. But here's where things became genuinely uncomfortable. Because the issue wasn't that the messages contradicted Harry outright. It was that they complicated him. And complication, in a legal setting, is a slow poison. The questioning around the messages didn't begin with accusations. It began with framing. Harry was asked to describe his state of mind during the period in which these messages were sent, to revisit his own language, paranoia, suspicion, emotional strain, and to situate it against the reality of maintaining a long-distance relationship. He spoke thoughtfully, carefully. He explained how humor can become a shield, how sarcasm can function as a release valve when pressure feels constant, how private communication doesn't always reflect deeper truth. All of that is plausible, human, even. But plausibility isn't the same as alignment. And alignment is what the court was quietly testing. Because when the messages themselves were finally characterized, again, not quoted directly, but described in outline, it became clear that some carried a tone that didn't sit neatly within the psychological framework Harry had just laid out. Not panicked, not fearful, not hypervigilant. Some were light, some dismissive, some edged with irony in a way that suggested distance rather than distress. That's when the first visible shift occurred. Harry paused longer between answers. Not because he didn't understand the questions, but because he understood them too well. He was being asked, in effect, to reconcile two versions of himself, the man under siege and the man casually typing messages late at night. Those two selves aren't mutually exclusive, but the court wasn't interested in that nuance. It was interested in whether one fully explained the other. And then came the subtle escalation. The lawyer's questions began to focus less on how Harry felt and more on how he expressed himself. On word choice, on tone, on what could be inferred from the way he spoke about the people in his life at that time. Still no quotes. Still no dramatic reveals. Just implication. That's when the room grew noticeably quieter. Because implication forces everyone to lean forward, to imagine what's being referenced without being shown, to fill in the blanks with their own expectations. And that's dangerous territory for any witness. Harry was asked whether he recognized that private remarks, when read years later, could appear inconsistent with later public expressions of devotion and pain. It's a deceptively gentle question, because the answer is obvious. Of course they can, but admitting that opens another door. It opens the possibility that what felt true later may not have been fully true at the time, or that what felt casual at the time may not withstand retrospective meaning. And once you admit that, the court is entitled to ask, which version should we trust? That's the moment the messages stopped being background material. They became central, because buried within them, according to those present, were remarks about another woman. Not hostile, not cruel, but flippant in a way that startled people once the timeline was understood. The significance wasn't in the content alone. It was in the timing. These messages weren't sent years before or years after the relationship in question. They weren't part of some distant emotional chapter. They sat in a window that overlapped with Harry's own description of emotional devastation caused by press intrusion. That overlap matters, because it raises a question the court can't ignore. If the press was exerting such an overwhelming, singular pressure on his emotional life, why do some of these messages read as emotionally detached? Again, this is not an accusation. It's an inquiry. And inquiries don't need answers to be effective. They just need to exist. What made this particularly fraught was the subject matter. Because the messages reportedly referenced Meghan, not as a central figure, but as a presence on the periphery of Harry's life at the time. And the tone, according to those familiar with the material, was casual, minimizing, almost throwaway. That's where the tension sharpened. Because Harry's public narrative about Meghan is defined by gravity, by fate, by inevitability, by the sense that meeting her marked a profound shift in his life. That may all be true, but private messages sent before that narrative solidified tell a different kind of truth, one rooted in uncertainty, in hedging, in emotional nonchalance. And courts are very good at spotting the difference between a story that evolved organically and a story that was refined in retrospect. No one in the room needed the messages read aloud to understand their impact. The mere acknowledgement of their tone was enough. Harry's legal team began to contextualize more aggressively. They emphasized the informality of private speech, the way people often minimize or joke about things they don't yet understand the significance of. The danger of reading early messages through the lens of later events. Again, valid points. But context can't erase record. It can only sit beside it. And sitting beside something isn't the same as neutralizing it. What became clear, as the questioning continued, was that the court was no longer interested in whether these messages were kind or unkind, fair or unfair. It was interested in what they revealed about Harry's internal narrative at the time. Was he already emotionally distancing himself from Chelsy? Was he already compartmentalizing relationships? Was the press truly the primary driver of collapse, or merely one factor among several? These questions don't accuse. They destabilize. And destabilization is far more dangerous in a credibility-driven case. Harry attempted to answer them honestly. He spoke about uncertainty, about not knowing how things would unfold, about the way relationships can overlap emotionally before they do in any formal sense. There was no sense of evasion, but there was a sense of strain, because answering these questions requires walking a very narrow line. Admit too much, and you undermine the simplicity of your claim. Admit too little, and you appear disconnected from your own words. That's the trap the messages created. Not because they proved something specific, but because they refused to disappear. They lingered. In the pauses between questions, in the way answers were framed, in the recalibration of the room, and perhaps most importantly, they lingered in the silence around one particular line, a line reportedly so dismissive in tone that it forced everyone present to confront an uncomfortable reality. That even deeply significant relationships often begin in casual language. And casual language doesn't age well under oath. That's the paradox Harry found himself facing. He is being asked to defend the sanctity of his private life while having his private words dissected from meaning, to argue that intrusion caused emotional harm while acknowledging that his own language sometimes reflected emotional distance. Both things can be true, but courts don't thrive on both. They thrive on clarity, and clarity was slipping. As the session drew to a close, the sense that something irreversible had happened became harder to ignore. Not because of a single revelation, but because of accumulation. The messages had shifted the gravitational center of the case. From what the press did to Harry, to how Harry himself navigated intimacy, uncertainty, and transition. And that shift opens doors that don't close easily. Because once private tone becomes public evidence, the next question is inevitable. If this is how he spoke in private, what else was happening at the same time? And that question doesn't just invite further scrutiny. Timing doesn't accuse. It doesn't editorialize. It doesn't raise its voice. It just sits there. And once it's in the room, everything else has to arrange itself around it. That was the realization that quietly took hold as the court began doing what courts do best, aligning events not by memory, not by emotion, but by date. Because dates don't care how things felt later. They only care about when something happened. Up until this point, Harry's story had moved largely on emotional chronology, a sense of before and after, a gradual erosion, a long, exhausting siege that wore relationships down until they could no longer stand. That kind of narrative makes intuitive sense. It mirrors how people actually experience their lives, rarely as clean sequences, mostly as overlapping feelings that blur into each other over time. But legal proceedings don't operate on intuition. They operate on math. And math has no patience for blur. The moment private messages entered the case, the emotional arc Harry had been describing was forced into something more rigid. Periods had to be named. Windows had to be defined. Overlaps had to be acknowledged or denied. And that's where things became uncomfortable. Because once the court began mapping message timestamps against the milestones Harry had already testified about, periods of heightened paranoia, alleged press intrusion, claimed emotional collapse, the picture stopped being linear. It became layered. Some messages landed exactly where expected. Frustration, fatigue, complaints about pressure, a sense of being trapped by attention he couldn't control. Those supported Harry's account, but others landed elsewhere. In moments Harry had described as breaking points, there were messages that suggested emotional distance rather than overwhelm. In periods characterized as uniquely corrosive, there were exchanges that read as surprisingly casual. Again, not cruel, not heartless, just unburdened. And that's where the court's interest sharpened. Because the law doesn't need to decide which version is more authentic emotionally. It only needs to decide whether the harm Harry attributes to one cause can be cleanly linked to it. Overlapping timelines make that difficult. Very difficult. The questions began to reflect that difficulty. Harry was asked to clarify when certain feelings began. Not broadly, precisely. To situate the onset of paranoia, suspicion, and emotional strain against specific stretches of time. He did his best. He spoke about escalation, about how the pressure wasn't constant but cumulative, about how certain incidents amplified existing stress rather than creating it from nothing. All reasonable. But reason doesn't dissolve overlap. It just explains how it might have felt. The court, meanwhile, was assembling something else entirely. A matrix. On one side, Harry's descriptions of emotional impact. On the other, contemporaneous communications. And in the spaces where those didn't align perfectly, questions grew. Because when timelines overlap, causation becomes murky. If emotional distance existed before the most severe alleged intrusions, can those intrusions be said to have caused it entirely? If detachment appears alongside professed devastation, What does that say about the nature of the straying? These aren't moral questions. They're analytical ones. And they're the kind that make judges lean back slightly, not because they're disengaged, but because they're recalculating. One of the most delicate overlaps involved Harry's own characterization of transition, the period where one relationship was winding down emotionally, while another was, at least conceptually, beginning. This is where human experience and legal framing diverge sharply. Most people understand that emotional overlap happens, that feelings don't turn off cleanly, that interest can spark before commitment, that detachment can coexist with affection. But in court, overlap raises flags, not because it's wrong, but because it complicates claims of singular causation. Harry's narrative has leaned heavily on the idea that press intrusion made normal relationship evolution impossible, that it accelerated deterioration, that it robbed him of the space to process change organically. But the messages introduced a different possibility, that some of that evolution was already underway, quietly, privately, without a headline in sight. And that possibility doesn't negate his pain. It just reframes its source. This is where timing becomes such a formidable adversary. Because once the court sees that emotional shifts predated or coincided with alleged external pressures, it has to consider alternative explanations. Not to disprove Harry, but to contextualize him. And context can dilute even the most compelling claims. Harry was asked, gently, whether he agreed that relationships can end for multiple reasons at once, whether he accepted that internal dynamics might have played a role alongside external ones. He didn't resist the idea. He acknowledged complexity. He spoke about how press intrusion didn't create every problem, but magnified them, how it took fragile moments and made them unbearable. That's a subtle but important concession, because magnification is harder to prove than creation. To prove creation, you point to before and after. To prove magnification, you have to quantify intensity. And intensity is subjective. Messages, by contrast, are not. They don't convey intensity cleanly. They convey tone. And tone doesn't always scale. A flippant line can exist alongside genuine distress. A casual remark can mask deeper turmoil. Anyone who's ever texted through a difficult period knows this. But courts don't assume masks. They examine patterns. And patterns emerge most clearly when things overlap. What made this phase of the case particularly delicate was how little the defense needed to say. They didn't argue aggressively that Harry's relationships would have failed regardless of the press. They didn't need to. They simply allowed the overlaps to exist. They let the court see that the emotional timeline Harry described wasn't as cleanly segmented as the legal argument might prefer. That was enough. Because once the court accepts that multiple dynamics were at play, the question shifts from, did the press cause harm, to how much harm did the press cause, relative to other factors? And that's a very different question, one that opens the door to partial causation, to shared responsibility, to reduced damages. These are not emotional judgments. They're legal ones, and they hinge on timing. Harry sensed this shift. You could hear it in the way his answers began to include more qualifiers, more acknowledgments of uncertainty, more careful phrasing. He wasn't backing away from his story. He was adapting it. But adaptation has a cost. Because the more nuance you introduce, the less force absolutes carry. And absolutes have been doing a lot of work in this case. Words like destroyed, words like knowingly false, words like snowball effect. Those words imply inevitability, a loss of control, a singular trajectory. Overlaps imply choice, or at least agency. And agency is complicated when you're arguing victimhood. None of this suggests Harry was fabricating his experience. It suggests something more uncomfortable, that his experience may not fit neatly into the legal categories he's been using to describe it. And courts are not obligated to smooth those edges. They're obligated to examine them. As this realization settled in, it became clear that the next phase of questioning wouldn't revolve around whether Harry's feelings were real. They would revolve around whether his timeline supports his theory of harm. And timelines, once laid out, don't lie. They just ask questions. Questions like, what else was happening emotionally at the same time? What expectations existed before the press allegedly intervened? What decisions were already in motion? These questions don't accuse. They probe. And probing doesn't stop once it starts. Because overlaps don't just involve one relationship ending. They involve another beginning. And as the court began to align dates more closely, it became increasingly clear that the next area of focus wouldn't be Chelsy herself. It would be the emergence of someone else into the emotional landscape. Someone who, at the time, may have seemed peripheral, but who, in retrospect, would become central to everything that followed. And once that realization landed, the room understood something else too. The most consequential overlaps hadn't even been fully explored yet. Before Meghan was a symbol, before she was a lightning rod, before she became the gravitational center of a global narrative, she existed in a far less defined space. Not destiny, not inevitability, not even certainty, just possibility. And possibilities don't announce themselves the way outcomes do. They arrive quietly, often wrapped in doubt, often minimized by the very people who will later insist they always knew. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting just beneath the surface of this phase of the case. Because when the court's attention drifted from Chelsy Davy's messages toward the margins of Harry's emotional life at the time, it wasn't looking for romance. It was looking for orientation. What direction was he facing emotionally before the public narrative calcified? And that's where Meghan enters this story. Not as the woman the world would come to know, but as an idea still forming, still undefined, still spoken about in the casual shorthand people use when they don't yet understand the weight of what they're saying. This is delicate territory, not because it implicates wrongdoing, not because it suggests betrayal, but because it exposes the difference between how stories begin and how they're later told. In court, that difference matters. Because Harry's public account of his relationship with Meghan is framed as transformative, as a turning point, as a moment of clarity after years of chaos and intrusion. And again, that may be true. But private messages sent before that clarity emerged don't always speak in the language of transformation. They speak in the language of uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't age gracefully. The court was careful here. No one was interested in adjudicating romance. No one was prying into intimacy for its own sake. The questions remained tethered to relevance. Timing, tone, consistency. The lawyer didn't ask Harry how he felt about Meghan in some abstract, emotional sense. That would have been improper. Instead, the inquiry focused on how he spoke about her privately during a period he had already characterized as emotionally destabilized by the press. And that's where the tension sharpened. Because according to those familiar with the material, some of the messages referencing Meghan were light, not dismissive in a cruel way, but casual in a way that stands in contrast to the reverence later attached to the relationship. This is where memory becomes a liability. Because once something becomes central to your life, you tend to retroactively assign its significance from the beginning. You smooth the origin story. You edit out ambivalence. You replace uncertainty with foreshadowing. But texts don't participate in that revision. They preserve the ambivalence. And ambivalence is not flattering when placed beside absolute claims. The court wasn't being asked to judge Harry's feelings. It was being asked to understand his mindset. And mindset is revealed not by what we say when we're careful, but by what we say when we assume no one else will ever see it. That's why these messages mattered. Not because they undermine Harry's later devotion, but because they reveal the provisional nature of early emotional commitments. In one reported exchange, again, not read aloud, not dramatized, Harry's tone about Meghan was described as minimizing, as if he himself wasn't sure what this new presence in his life would become. That's normal, human, almost universal. But normality doesn't always help legal narratives. Because Harry's case leans heavily on the idea that the press distorted his relationships. That external intrusion warped how things unfolded, leaving him little control over his emotional life. Yet these messages suggest that, at least initially, Harry himself was keeping things light, non-committal, even protective of his own uncertainty. That's not a moral failing. It's a contradiction. And contradictions are where court cases quietly turn. What made this moment particularly fraught was the way it reframed earlier testimony without directly challenging it. Harry had spoken movingly about how the press made it impossible to nurture relationships privately, how constant speculation robbed him of the ability to let things develop organically. But these messages show something else happening simultaneously, that he was, in some respects, choosing emotional distance, or at least emotional hedging, that he wasn't yet all in. And that choice, even if unconscious. Complicates the claim that external pressure alone dictated the course of his relationships. The legal question becomes subtle but significant. If Harry himself was emotionally tentative, does press intrusion still bear sole responsibility for relational strain? Or was the press amplifying dynamics that were already present? Again, this doesn't exonerate anyone. It doesn't erase harm, but it does redistribute it. And redistribution matters when damages are on the table. Harry, to his credit, didn't deny the tentative nature of early relationships. He spoke about how feelings evolve, how initial uncertainty doesn't preclude later depth, how people often speak lightly about things they haven't yet fully processed. All of that is true, but courts are less interested in what eventually happened than in what can be demonstrated at the time. And at the time, these messages suggest a man still navigating options, still calibrating his emotional investments. Which means the narrative of inevitability, of Meghan as an immediate refuge from chaos, becomes harder to sustain in its purest form. This is where the phrase "before Meghan" takes on weight, not as an indictment, but as a reminder. Before Meghan became the answer to everything, she was a question, and questions don't support absolutes. What's striking is how restrained the courtroom remained during this phase. No one leaned into sensationalism. No one tried to provoke a reaction. The power of the moment came from its understatement. A lawyer referencing tone, a witness acknowledging uncertainty, a judge listening without interruption, because everyone understood the implication. Once you admit that the early stages of your most important relationship were marked by doubt, hedging, or emotional distance, you also admit that not all of your relational pain can be attributed to outside forces. Some of it belongs to the natural messiness of human transition. And that's a hard thing to reconcile with a legal case built on external causation. Harry's team attempted to bridge that gap by emphasizing the difference between private speech and private feeling, by arguing that casual language doesn't reflect emotional truth, that people often downplay things precisely because they don't want to jinx them. Again, plausible. But plausibility is not proof. And courts don't operate on what might have been meant. They operate on what can be shown. Which is why this phase of the case feels so pivotal, because it marks the moment where Harry's inner narrative, the one he's told himself about how his life unfolded, is being gently but firmly tested against his own contemporaneous record, not to shame him, but to measure him. And measurement is an unforgiving process. The presence of Meghan in these messages doesn't cast her in a negative light. If anything, it humanizes the beginning of a relationship that would later be mythologized. But it also strips away some of the moral clarity that later storytelling relies on. It reminds the court and the audience that stories don't start the way they end. They start messy, uncertain, contradictory. And when those contradictions are preserved in writing, they don't disappear just because the ending turns out differently. As the court moved through this material, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't about diminishing Meghan's importance. It was about questioning Harry's consistency, about whether the emotional certainty he now expresses was present when it mattered legally, at the time the alleged harm occurred. And that's a question with no comfortable answer. Because if the certainty came later, the causation argument weakens. If the certainty existed earlier but wasn't reflected in private messages, credibility becomes an issue. Either way, the ground shifts. And as this realization settled, the focus of the case prepared to move again. Because if Harry's early language about Meghan reveals emotional tentativeness, the next logical question is whether that tentativeness extended beyond romance, whether it reflected a broader pattern in how he processed stress, pressure, and transition. And once that question is asked, the case no longer revolves solely around relationships. It revolves around behavior, patterns, habits. And those don't stay confined to one part of a life. There's a point in every long case where the language shifts, not because someone decides it should, but because the old words stop carrying the weight they once did. That's where this landed. Up to now, Harry's testimony had leaned heavily on one central idea: paranoia. The feeling of being watched. The sense that nothing, not even private communication, was safe from intrusion. It's a powerful claim. It explains hypervigilance. It explains withdrawal. It explains why relationships might buckle under strain that others never experience. But when the court began placing that claim beside the tone of Harry's private messages, something didn't quite line up. And the misalignment wasn't dramatic enough to reject outright. It was subtle enough to trouble. Because paranoia, as Harry described it, implies a tightening, a narrowing, a sense that words must be chosen carefully, that jokes carry risk, that emotional exposure is dangerous. Yet some of the messages under discussion didn't read that way. They read loose, not reckless, not foolish, but unguarded in a way that felt inconsistent with someone who believed every channel was compromised. That's where the contradiction took shape. And contradictions don't need to be absolute to matter. They just need to exist. The court didn't challenge Harry on whether paranoia is real. It didn't suggest he fabricated it. Instead, the questioning moved towards something far more uncomfortable: how paranoia manifests. Does it make people colder? Or more ironic? Does it silence them? Or does it push them toward humor as camouflage? These are not questions with clean answers. But courts don't need clean answers. They need to know whether an explanation can reasonably account for the evidence in front of them. Harry's legal team leaned into the psychology. They spoke about coping mechanisms, about how people under stress sometimes adopt levity precisely because the stakes feel too heavy to confront directly. Sarcasm as armor, detachment as self-preservation. Again, plausible. But plausibility began to compete with something else: pattern. Because as more messages were contextualized, a pattern emerged that wasn't easily reduced to fear. There was irony, yes, but also ease. There was deflection, but also emotional distance. And distance is not the same as protection. Protection is reactive. Distance is directional. That distinction matters. If paranoia drove Harry's communication, one might expect a defensive tone, guarded language, coded references, a pulling inward. But what appeared instead, at least in some exchanges, was a pulling away. Not from the press, from emotional entanglement. And that raises a difficult question. Was Harry primarily responding to external threat or to internal transition? The court didn't ask it outright. It didn't need to, because once the idea is planted, it does its work quietly. Harry himself seemed to sense the narrowing path. His answers grew more layered, more reflective. He spoke about living in contradiction, wanting closeness while fearing exposure, about oscillating between openness and detachment. There was nothing disingenuous about it. But layered answers are harder to rely on legally, because layers invite interpretation, and interpretation opens space for doubt. The phrase snowball effect came up again during this phase, Harry's own language for how press intrusion compounded over time, creating pressure that grew heavier with each story. It's a compelling metaphor. But snowballs rolled downhill in one direction. What the messages suggested was something more erratic. Pressure building in one area, release in another. Emotional investment shifting, not simply shrinking. That's not a snowball. That's a redistribution. And redistribution complicates blame. The court's attention lingered on this distinction longer than expected. Not because it was trying to undermine Harry's emotional reality, but because emotional reality doesn't automatically translate into legal causation. If Harry was already emotionally distancing himself, consciously or not, then press intrusion may have accelerated the end of a relationship without being its sole architect. That doesn't erase harm, but it changes its legal weight. Harry was asked whether he believed his paranoia ever caused him to minimize relationships internally as a form of self-protection. It's an astute question, because minimization can look like detachment from the outside, even when it feels like survival from the inside. Harry didn't dismiss the idea. He acknowledged that stress can distort perception, that under constant pressure, people may downplay things that feel too fragile to examine directly. Once again, human. But notice what keeps happening. Each explanation introduces another variable, another layer, another reason why the outcome cannot be attributed to a single cause. And single cause is the backbone of this case. Without it, everything becomes proportional, shared, reduced.